Today is class 42. We are going to be covering the remainder of Genesis chapter 45, that is verses 9 through 29. And then we will be skipping over the portion that is a genealogy, where it lists all of the different people that were brought with Jacob into Egypt. And then we'll be going over chapter 46 as well. So if you recall, we left off last week with Joseph giving the big reveal as to who he was and what he's been playing at. And there was this great reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. And so we'll be picking up at verse 9, which goes, "Hurry up," says Joseph, "hurry up and go to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here.' Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him." So as I said, the scene immediately follows Jacob's revelation about his true identity. And now his brothers are told to go up to Jacob with the good news. Now contrast this return journey with the journey that the brothers had feared, as voiced in Judah's impassioned speech back in chapter 40. I put 45, but I should have said 44, where he said, "Go up to my father and come down to me." Handel writes, "Go up to my father and come down to me," which revised the symbolic contrast of going up and coming down in Judah's speech. Now their father will come down to Joseph rather than to Sheol. So previously it was feared that the return journey of Joseph's brothers may have meant their father's undoing. Now their father will be coming down to Joseph to a great blessing. And this is a blessing that even Jacob could not have foreseen, as will be evidenced by his reaction to the news of Joseph's good fortune in verse 26. Handel writes, "After Joseph's speech, the others hug, kiss, and weep, recalling the emotional reunion of Jacob and Esau. Joseph hugs Benjamin first, signaling their special bond. At last, calmed of their fears, the brothers talked with him. The testing is at last over. Joseph bears no grudge going forward." And if you've been with us in previous lessons, you know that this has been a long and arduous process for these brothers who have really been put through the ringer. At last, the testing is over. Verse 16. "When the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers have come. Pharaoh and his servants were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Say to your brothers, do this. Load your animals and go back to the land of Canaan. Take your father and your households and come to me, so that I may give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you may enjoy the fat of the land. You are further charged to say, do this. Take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Give no thought to your possessions, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours.'" Now, Pharaoh doesn't explicitly say where this best land in Egypt will be, but earlier Joseph had said to his brothers to go and get their father and that they would settle in the land of Goshen. And here I've provided a picture of where Goshen was, which is basically the region around the Nile Delta. There would have been a land that in parts would have been very lush and fertile, as it was fed by the waters and the soot and the sediments of the Nile would have brought down to the basin. But also it would have been swampy in some parts, and so not all of it would have been great. And this is that part of Egypt that intrigues me greatly, as this was thought of as Lower Egypt. I know it's north on the map for us, but they thought of it as Lower Egypt. And much of what had been built there in antiquity has been lost to the swamps into the water, into decay, whereas up in the northern part where it's more dry and arid, where you get the Valley of the Kings and the Great Pyramids, a lot of that is preserved. And so I often wonder what has been lost in those waters. Now, Goshen, as I said, I haven't said, is the Hebrew name that the biblical writers give to the northeastern part of Egypt in the Nile Delta, the part that we're talking about. Now, taking this text alone, the reader is left with the impression that Pharaoh is being exceedingly generous. Joseph's instructions are seconded by Pharaoh, who extends great generosity to Joseph's family, granting them the best of the land of Egypt. And we don't know what land Pharaoh means, but we already know where Joseph wants them to settle. Pharaoh's beneficence contrasts with the actions of his later successor, who did not know Joseph. That would be Ramses II, as in the very beginning of the book of Exodus. Indeed, the offer of the land of Goshen is a good one if what one wants is good land for raising and caring for livestock. But as we'll read at the end of Genesis 46, Pharaoh's motives for granting this request may well have been diplomatic as well. More on that later. But for now, let's not be so cynical. Fritham writes, Pharaoh's pleased response, willed with generosity and goodwill, proves startling. In view of events in Exodus, this positive portrayal of the Egyptians commands attention, alluding to possible reconciliation for nations, even Egypt and Israel, as well as families. Historically, pharaohs were generous to Semitic peoples in time of famine. This just reminds me of something that's been a recurring theme in the book of Genesis, which is we don't have this antagonism or as much antagonism between the Israelites or the ancestors of the Israelites and the surrounding tribes and nations. In fact, many times those surrounding tribes, especially Egypt, serve as a blessing to the Israelite people in the book of Genesis, which we'll not see is the case in the book of Exodus. But I like what Fratham points out here, which this positive portrayal alludes to a possible reconciliation for nations. Things don't have to be tribal warfare and discontent between peoples. All right, verse 21. The sons of Israel did so. In other words, they go back to their father. And Joseph gave them wagons according to the instruction of Pharaoh, and he gave them provisions for the journey. To each one of them, he gave a set of garments. But to Benjamin, he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 sets of garments. To his father, he sent the following: 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provision for his father on the journey. Then he sent his brothers on their way, and as they were leaving, he said to them, don't quarrel. Also could be translated, be agitated, but don't quarrel along the way. Now, this should all be very familiar. Back in Genesis chapter 37, Joseph's father gave him that long-sleeved coat, or sometimes translated coat of many colors, a coat to set him apart as the preferred, favored son. Now, Joseph elevates the status of his brothers by giving them each a coat or a garment. But notice he singles Benjamin out for special favor, gives him silver and 5 of these sets of garments. The garments, writes Handel, again signals an ascent in status. Joseph's greater gift to Benjamin recalls Israel's favoritism of Joseph, expressed by his special long brother. As a gentle reminder of the past, it is clear that Joseph is most pleased at the reunion between he and his full brother Benjamin. You may recall in the previous lesson that he wept very hard when he saw Benjamin. And this is not the first time that he has singled him out for special favor. In chapter 43, he gave Benjamin more from his table when he was treating his brothers to a great feast. So whilst a brother showing favoritism for another brother is different than a parent showing favoritism for one child over another, Joseph sends them off with a warning: do not quarrel. Perhaps this is meant to serve as a reminder of the past and lessons learned. You can even imagine him saying this with a great sense of irony. Perhaps this isn't a dire warning so much as a subtle, playful reminder as to the journey that they have been on up to this point. And you could even read that last line as evidence there has been true reconciliation. Or perhaps Joseph is simply trying to warn his brothers to fall back into old patterns. Verse 25. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, and they told him, Joseph is alive. Joseph is still alive. He is even ruler over all the land of Egypt. He was stunned. He could not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph that he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Israel said, "Enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I must go and see him before I die." Joseph is alive. The brothers' first words to Jacob echoed Joseph's first words to them after his self-revelation. "Is my father still alive?" Verse 3. After being stunned, or another translation could be numb, Jacob is floored at this revelation. Jacob's spirit revived, which literally means came alive. The news that Joseph is alive brings Jacob, in a sense, back to life. This man who had feared that news of Benjamin's loss would plummet his soul to Sheol is now finding the exact opposite to be the case. Israel dramatizes this point and makes Joseph's instructions his own by saying, "I must go and see him before I die." Enough, writes Fritham, is shorthand for Jacob's willingness to put the past behind him and get on with new possibilities, presented by his surprising good news. The parental trauma that Jacob experienced in chapter 37, 31 through 35, when he first heard that Joseph had been killed or had allegedly been killed, turned out not to be the case. Well, that trauma now comes full circle. Life and joy once more fill the family scene. God enables the past to be forgotten and makes new beginnings possible. Yet more will come. Chapter 46, verse 1. When Israel set out on his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to God of his father Isaac. God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will bring you up again, and Joseph's own hand shall close your eyes." Handel writes, at the altar that Isaac built in Beersheba, so his father built this altar back in chapter 26, God reveals himself to Jacob for the last time and outlines the future. Bring you up again has a double meaning. God will bring Jacob up to Canaan to be buried by Joseph in chapter 50, and God will bring the Israelites up from Egypt in the Exodus. So his own return will parallel the return of his people in future years. I think that these reminders of the promise God made with Abraham back in Genesis 12, also I referenced several here, chapter 13, verse 16, 15, 1 through 6. You could see them there. I think that these instances are meant to remind the characters in these stories and the reader as well that God is still working to make good on the promises made to Abraham. Whether their descendants find themselves in foreign lands or in the promised land in exile, God is striving with them towards their blessing. Jacob/Israel is reminded on the way to Egypt that the promise made to Abraham and his descendants will not be nullified by this interlude into a foreign land. Now, Genesis 28, verse 15 reads, this is going back, it's just these words were spoken to Jacob, though. This is still part of Jacob's story. "Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." These were words spoken to Jacob when he was returning to Esau, and he this at this exact same spot. This is the scene where he sees angels ascending and descending into the heavens and back down, and it's his promise that he will always go with him. Actually, this is where he was fleeing from Esau, I believe. Either way, this was a promise that God had made to Jacob at this same spot when he was in a different transition in his life. Moreover, writes Fritham, God will go down with him to Egypt. This statement constitutes a new version of God's promise of presence to Jacob in chapter 28, verse 15, what I just quoted. It not only specifies presence, but it emphasizes that this will be a journey for God. This represents a deep commitment of God to enter into all the dynamics of the Egyptian experience. God will go down with Jacob to Egypt. So God is journeying along the way with him. Verse 5 Then Jacob set out from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones, and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry them. They also took their livestock and the goods that they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and they came to Egypt. God and all his Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, all his offspring he brought with him to Egypt. Now, we are going to skip over the genealogical list that is written in verses 8 through 27 because, well, lists of names are hard to track with and kind of boring to read. But I will summarize basically what their content is. So Jacob journeys out and down into Egypt. So what follows in verses 8 through 27 is a summary list of all the families and the persons who made the move to Egypt. We will not be reading the list now, and here is some commentary on the list. Hybert writes, as is typical of an Israelite household, the list includes 3 generations: Jacob, the oldest male and head of the household, and his wives, his children, and his grandchildren. The record that follows shares much information with other records of Jacob's household, found in Genesis 35, Exodus 6, and Numbers 26, and 1 Chronicles chapters 2 through 8. And as I said, chapters 2 through 8. Beginning of the book of Chronicles is basically a list of names. As is customary in many biblical genealogies, women are almost entirely omitted. The few mentioned aren't counted in the number of offspring provided in Genesis chapter 26, writes Hybert. Handel writes, the list of Jacob and his descendants who came to Egypt interrupts this action and adds a degree of grandeur to the journey. 70, a number representing wholeness. The list was originally a separate document that has been adapted to its context here. An editorial comment in verse 26 observes that only 66 of Jacob's family came into Egypt, including and Onan, who died in the land, excluding and Onan, who died in the land of Canaan, and Manasseh and Ephraim, who were born in the land of Egypt. Joseph's status in this list is, however, obscure since he is in Egypt, but seems to be included among the 66. These problems are simplified in Exodus 1:5, which states that the total number of people born to Jacob was 70 and that Joseph was already in Egypt. Verse 28, picking up after that list of names. Israel sent Judah ahead to Joseph to lead the way before him to Goshen. When they came to the land of Goshen, Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to meet his father Israel in Goshen. He presented himself to him, fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. Israel said to Joseph, I can die now, having seen for myself that you are still alive. Jacob recognizes Judah's leadership in having him prepare the way for their entry into Egypt. When Joseph hears of their arrival in the land of Goshen, he takes the initiative to greet his father. Tears, not words, once again flow from this sensitive man as father and son embrace at length, joyfully reunited after so many years apart. Joseph appears before his father as a son, not a public official, with appropriate levels of emotional intensity. And notice no fulfillment of his second dream seems in view, where his father and his mother, who by now is dead, were going to bow before him. It doesn't seem like that is in the stars, pun intended. Fritham writes, verse 30 brings one dimension of the Joseph story full circle. The violence of chapter 37 is turned into life. Jacob, who had lamented that he would go into death mourning, and whose life had been so pervaded by loss, now announces that he can die with the joy of knowing that his son, who was lost, has been found. And here's, as promised, our Lego picture. Verse 31. Joseph said to his brothers and his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who were in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our ancestors, in order that you may settle in the land of Goshen, because all shepherds are abhorrent to the Egyptians. Fritham writes, Pharaoh might be concerned about a settlement in Goshen, which Joseph wanted because his family would be nearby, but which Pharaoh could find difficult for some reason, perhaps because this is a border region and would hem him in case these newcomers turn violent. Maybe it's because Goshen is somewhat removed from the settled lands of Egypt. Joseph devises a plan that would allow his family to move there, perhaps a convenient place for escape. He directs his brothers to stress that they are shepherds, keepers of livestock, because shepherding was an unappealing occupation to Egyptians. Thus, Pharaoh would be glad to have them at a distance, and Joseph would not compromise his own position among the Egyptians. I guess all this to say, it's hard telling why Joseph is thinking that perhaps Pharaoh will not grant them the request of land in Goshen. And so he is trying to ensure that this is the case by their mentioning that they are keepers of livestock, which was an occupation which was looked down upon in Egypt. And so they would want to keep these shepherds and their stinky livestock and all that was involved at a distance, which would make Goshen an ideal location. So that's why Joseph instructs his brothers to tell them that. Hybert writes, guests who work for Egyptians, shepherding their livestock, are less of a threat than visitors who seek land. In short, here is an arrangement that would work for everyone. Egyptians don't want shepherds or strangers nearby. Goshen, being on the outskirts, seems perfect. In addition, the land seems perfectly suited to the needs of Joseph's family. So they end up in Goshen. Closing thoughts. I especially like the part at the beginning of chapter 46 where Jacob/Israel is assured of God's continued presence as they enter into Egypt. This new chapter in Israel's life was not expected, and he may well wonder if God's plans for him and his offspring were going off the rails. God assures him that this is not the case, but that God would go with him into the land of Egypt. This assurance would no doubt hearten future readers who often approach these stories whilst in exile or under foreign occupation. Things never did pan out as expected, but through it all, they could hold on to the assurance that God was ever with them. Just as Joseph found himself enslaved, imprisoned, and put upon time and time again, he discovered in time that God was still able to cultivate life and blessing from unexpected places. Next week, we'll be covering Genesis chapter 47. Here are the sources. Sorry for all of the interruptions. Did it continue to go smoothly? Going as I
Yes.
Good.
It's definitely some good insight there.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, no problem.
Hey.
Put your head down.
The only thing that I've always had a hard time understanding. Of course, I have the Braille Bible, but a lot of times with the genealogy and stuff, it's easier to read that on the computer because the names are so long and hard to figure out how to enunciate them and stuff like that. But I've always been curious as to why, because you never hear pastors doing any sermons on genealogies or
Don't eat the Jane up.
anything like that, which for good reason. Kind of had a hard time understanding why that's even relevant to scripture and why it was put in there.
Well, because the scriptures to the Israelites and the first people who wrote them down and the first people who had them narrated to them before they were written down, they were far more than just instructions to life as we see the Bible today, or as many see the Bible today, or stories with moralistic teachings. They were the history of their people, and they saw their identity not so much as individuals standing alone, but as wrapped in their ancestral identity. So for them to say, I am a child of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, meant something worse. What if I told somebody, I don't introduce myself as Heath, child of Dennis, right? That's just not the way our culture works. And so
Right.
these genealogies were important to help the people reading them later understand their place in the whole, that these stories were not just stories about people in the past, but stories about them as they were their ancestors, and they believed that that their ancestors lived on by way of their own lives. That was the way that the afterlife was viewed for the ancient Hebrews, that they lived on through their children and offspring.
That makes
Bloodlines
sense.
were important.
Bloodlines were important in helping you understand who you were.
And they pointed to the coming of Christ.
What's nice about the genealogies is Christ came through very humble. The names in the genealogies, especially when women are mentioned in the genealogies, they're often women with questionable story, and whether they were, we talked about Tamar, Ruth's
Or
story,
Ruth.
Or
Rahab, who let David's
Naomi,
yeah.
the Moabite.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
They're both. Go ahead, Judy. Sorry.
No, you're finishing up a point. I was starting a new one. So
Well, I was
finish
just
away.
going to say the Gospels of Matthew and Luke begin with genealogies.
Right. Yeah, I knew they did. Of course, the names in that seem to be much easier to read. And they're not as necessarily as long, but like you'd mentioned, the opening of First Chronicles and parts of Genesis and Exodus, I mean, such long lists, and it's like, I'd always been wondering, why is that so relevant? So that's good insight.
So at the very end of this chapter, now see, I haven't read these chapters like beginning to end. I think I've just read little pieces of these books, the first books of the Hebrew Bible. So I don't know how these are all connected and contiguous, but I was really shocked to get to the end of this chapter. Joseph has gone to great lengths to bring his whole family to Egypt, saying, you've got to come be near me because there's this famine and drought. It's going to last another 5 years. I've got to be able to feed you, protect you, whatever. And then he tells them, well, and I wasn't sure what he was saying. Was he saying, is it the same to say, where is it? You tell the Pharaoh you're a keeper of cattle and always have been because they don't like shepherds. Is it different to be a keeper of cattle versus being a shepherd? I mean, are those one and the same, or are they different? But and they don't say the same. Okay,
Think of them as one and the same.
But then to say it's abhorrent. I mean, it's not just they don't like them; they're abhorrent to the Egyptians. So he's bringing his family into a place where who they are and what they do. I mean, that's what they are. They're shepherds. It's abhorrent to this place where he's brought them, lock, stock, and barrel.
I think that's why Joseph wanted this area that was off and far away so that they could remain a community in themselves and not be involved so much with the Egyptian community.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll see how I'm on tenterhooks now. Is that going to work out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, next week's story is one that is not very often told. There's actually two. Well, there's at the heart of chapter 47, we read of another reason why the Hebrews might have been put on a trajectory for antagonism in Egypt. It's one that I actually had missed. I mean, I've read through Genesis before, but I never really considered the story very carefully. And so we'll be looking for these clues as to what could be setting them off on a trajectory for the time of Ramses II, where he does not remember Joseph.
The time of Joseph. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I know. I mean, I'm sure Joseph is being sincere. He sincerely wants to help us. He loves his family, wants to help them, but whew.
And the Pharaoh reads as sincere too, sincerely excited to bring Joseph's family. And that's why I mentioned earlier that perhaps this was a diplomatic, his granting the land is diplomatic, and that he's happy to let them have it, but also with the understanding that the people wouldn't want a whole bunch of shepherds moving into, Thebes or the places, the important places.
they wouldn't
Mo-
feel comfortable either. I mean, coming
Right,
into something
right.
like that, since they've been shepherds all their lives.
Just us farmers here.
That's
Yeah.
right.
yeah, because along the Nile River, not away from the delta, and we talked about the inundation, where every year the waters would go out and then go back and recede, and it would deposit new silt. And so you had, and to this very day, you have just a replenished supply of fertile farmland. So you can't out farm it. It's always rich and good for farming. And if you look at a satellite map of Egypt, you see this narrow strip of green going about 5 miles out on either side of the Nile for hundreds of miles. And that was where the majority of the Egyptians populated. And that's why we have so much by way of archaeological discoveries, because everything else outside of that is dry. You hit the edge of this. I mean, you hit the edge of the tree line, and it's desert. And so I think in one of our Bible studies, I shared a statistic earlier when we talked about this, that out of the entire population of Egypt, to this day, something like 95% of the population, something 90+% of the population live along this narrow strip. And the problem when you get into the Delta, first off, you don't need much more than that. You don't really need a large population of livestock if you've got so much grain. They did have livestock. As a matter of fact, they even had a cult around a bull, which was called the Apis bull, where it's kind of, oh no, I don't want to be disrespectful, so I won't say, but it's like a new bull is born every generation, and then once this bull will span its life out, and then when it dies, there's a big ceremony and it's a big deal, and then the christening, or that's my word for it, the induction of the new Apis bull is a big deal. It's almost like a deified bull. Kind of makes you wonder where the golden calf idea comes from. But anyway, my point is they did have cattle. So I'm not sure. I haven't looked at other sources outside of the Bible to find out to what degree this idea that the Egyptians loathe people who raise livestock. I haven't really looked into that beyond this line that we just take as part of the story here. But I would suspect many times when the stories about Egypt in the Bible are cross-referenced with what we know about Egypt today, it's clear that the tellers of these stories were aware of Egyptian culture and customs. There's things that you would have had to have been in Egypt to have known, as opposed to like Herodotus just going down the Nile and speculating wildly, which he does in his histories. There seems to be a real personal knowledge in these stories. And so when you get this line that raising livestock is abhorrent to the Egyptians, there probably was at least at this period in Egypt's history, that these stories are supposed to have happened, an antagonism to. And it worked out because they got the land of Goshen. So I guess that's good.
And while everybody else was dealing with a famine, they were given the best.
Yeah,
It's
true.
Yeah, that's the thing. It seemed like Goshen really, during that time frame anyway, really was blessed. It seemed when Israel moved in there, just for this. I mean, maybe not during the time of their slavery, but even later on, when God's ready to bring them out of Egypt. I mean, Scripture tells us that the only land that was spared was Goshen. So it seemed like they were really taken care of there, and at least during the time of Joseph.
And it doesn't say when everybody else was having to sell their livestock and then their grain and then their farms and then themselves that any of Joseph's family were having to do that.
Well, that's coming up in a second. Yeah,
Yeah.
you've read ahead.
Well, not recently. I have an issue with that story. So that's why I remember it.
I have an issue with that story too. I suspect we have the same issue.
Yeah.
Seems we'll get. I don't want to give too much away, but it seems like a pretty underhanded thing to have done.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that next week.
And once again, I'm impressed that in these early stories, and maybe it continues out throughout the Hebrew Bible, that God chooses imperfect people to ordain. That the people, the early fathers of Judaism are very imperfect people, and yet these are the ones that are given the task of establishing the faith. They're the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob / Israel, and the stories do not take the blemishes off of them. And so, Jacob is totally beside himself with, with regret and sorrow, and so much so that he practically can't function. And it's nice, because I think today sometimes we expect our spiritual leaders to be, if you look at the Catholic Church, especially, the Pope is practically a god, and I think we expect the priests to be completely celibate. They have to be cloistered and celibate, and all these things are maybe impossible because they really are humans, not godly.
And they are the ones that tell you what to do to be forgiven when they have that power. Supposedly.
I remember at a youth conference, there was a preacher, like one of those youth rally type things I went to, where the preacher went on and on for felt like 10 minutes about how guiltless they were, like how well they slept. I remember him using how well, when my head hits the pillow, I remember he said, and I won't do his Southern accent, but he said, when my head hits the pillow, I have nothing. I have a clear conscience because I'm perfect, and this was his belief was too, that God would create in you will give you the ability to never sin again, which was something he claimed, which was pretty big in the tradition that raised me. And
he had a pretty high opinion of himself.
In reflection, I'm thinking, man, you're spending a lot of time to try to convince us of this. First off, you spent 10 minutes just describing this feeling you have of feeling guiltless. And the stories of the heroes of the Bible rings true to life to even the stories we tell today, where the moment where you learn of the hero's vulnerability and flaws and imperfections, it gives it more depth to, if you're just taking it as a story, it gives more depth to the character, makes them more interesting, shows that the internal struggle that they felt through life on the balance tilted towards the good, which is far more impressive than somebody who just by almost default does the right thing in a robotic fashion. Which is unrealistic, and this is all causing.
It almost seems like he hadn't read the New Testament.
Well, he was
stuck in Genesis.
No, he was getting a lot of it from Paul's talk about. In the word, when Jesus said, "Be ye perfect, as my Father in heaven is perfect," in that context, it means be perfect in the way that you love others. And it isn't a blanket statement to be perfect in every area of your life, but they would take that to mean. But the first sermon I ever preached in a youth group was on that text, where I took it to mean, just parroting what I had heard, that you can be perfect. Literally, you can get to a place where God can give you the ability to never make another mistake. That's pretty harmful, but that's what I believe, and that's where this guy was coming from.
Wow.
Then you have the scripture, "Yea, I fall short of the glory of God," blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
The church has a lot of its sins still to be dealt with.
Yeah.
Because Paul certainly wasn't a perfect individual.
No.
He says, what I want to do, I don't do, and what I don't want to do, I do. So.
Who will rescue me from this body of sin? Well, this is a good place to end, especially being considerate of Josh's time, he needs to leave here in a few minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and in the meeting, and also I also have in mind this: the editing process for this is going to be a little more.
Have fun.
If it all works
Dead
well,
air.
if it all works well, I just cut out the middle
Interesting.
section. I just cut out the middle section and then
It'll
upload
be
it.
a
This case, I'm-
challenge. John said to let you know that he and Jay would pick up in the morning.
Okay,
Okay?
thank
Do
you.
you want to, do you
I'll
want to
be-
call me then? You
Yeah,
call
I'll
me when
call
you're free?
you. I'll call you and
Don't give a time, just generally, just sometime this afternoon.
Okay, we'll do.
Okay, all right, okay.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Monday.